12 years in our society," said the Ithkar delegate, his voice clicking through a translator that never quite caught his irritation. "And the humans have shared less technical data than a first contact probe. They do not attend our councils. They do not open their shipyards. They smile, they trade, and they say nothing." "Perhaps," said a Vren observer from the back row, "they have nothing worth hiding." Laughter rippled through the chamber. Nobody in that room had seen a human warship. Nobody had needed to. Humanity's borders were quiet, its fleet numbers modest on paper, its diplomats polite to the point of blandness. To the Accord, humans were the galaxy's newest neighbors, young, cautious, faintly ridiculous in their refusal to boast about anything. Overseer Velth Karrasin was not in that chamber, but he heard the recording later, on the bridge of his flagship, and he laughed too, though for different reasons. Karrasin did not believe in mysteries. He believed in maps, tonnage, and the plain arithmetic of war. His intelligence reports, expensive ones, bought through Ithkar brokers who traded information the way other species traded ore, described a human military that was small, defensive, and technologically ordinary. No accounts of any real engagement. No captured hardware worth studying. A species that had, as far as anyone could tell, never fought a war at all. "They have had 12 years to build an empire," Karrasin told his officers, standing at the head of the strategy table aboard the Ashwing Dominant. "And instead they built farms and trade routes. This is not caution. This is a people who do not yet understand what they are worth." He tapped the display, and a cluster of star systems lit up gold, human space, or the edge of it. "We will teach them." Only one officer in the room did not nod along. Tessa Vor stood near the back, arms folded, her four eyes tracking the star map with more care than enthusiasm. She had spent 3 years as a trade attaché on human worlds before transferring to fleet logistics, and she remembered things the intelligence reports did not mention. The way human negotiators never raised their voices, never made promises they couldn't measure, never once bluffed. She remembered a market administrator on a colony called Meridian Station, who ran her port with the calm precision of someone who had done something far harder than trade logistics before. "Overseer," Tessa Vor said carefully, "the reports say they're primitive. They don't say they're unprepared. Those aren't the same thing." Karrasin waved a hand. "Caution is admirable, Tessa Vor. It is also how careers stall." The room laughed again, softer this time, and Tessa Vor said nothing more. She had learned, on human worlds, that silence sometimes carried more weight than argument. She simply filed the thought away, the way she'd learned to file so many things about this quiet, watchful species. Meridian Station orbited a modest yellow star on what any map would call the frontier, new, small, unremarkable. Its director, Amara Osei, had run the place for 6 years, and in that time she had become known to her 12,000 colonists as thorough to the point of obsession. Every quarter she scheduled full evacuation drills. Every month she personally reviewed the station's sensor logs. The colonists called it her quirk, the price of working with a woman who had clearly seen something rough somewhere else in her life and never quite left it behind. What they didn't know, what almost no one still living knew, was that Amara Osei had not designed those drills to prepare for hypothetical disasters. She had designed them to prepare for one very specific thing, and she had been waiting 12 years for it to arrive. She was in the command ring, going over hull stress readings with her deputy, when the first alert came through. Elias Van Tor, 26 years old and endlessly earnest, was the one who saw it first, a gravitational disturbance at the edge of the system, too large and too structured to be natural. "Director." His voice didn't waver, but his hands did, just slightly on the console. "Multiple contacts, big ones, they're not hailing." Amara set down her tablet. She did not rush to the console. She walked to it the way she walked everywhere, like a woman conserving energy she might need later. She looked at the readings for exactly 4 seconds. "Drevakai hull signatures," she said quietly. "Expeditionary configuration." She straightened. "Elias, initiate contingency Cold Harbor, quietly. No station-wide alarm." "Cold Harbor? That's the one we've never actually run. That's—" "I know what it is," she said, and something in her voice made him stop asking questions. Do it now. 90 light seconds away, the lead elements of Karasin's fleet crossed into the Meridian system, and the silence began. It wasn't the silence of an empty system. Karasin's sensor officers reported human orbital stations, human shipping lanes, human colony signatures exactly where the old survey data placed them, but every attempt to hail the system met no response, not jamming, not static, simply nothing, as though the humans had chosen, collectively and precisely, not to answer. Long-range scans that should have painted a clear picture of Meridian Station's defenses returned instead a strange layered fog, structured just enough to prove it was deliberate. "They're hiding something," said Karasin's sensor chief. "They're hiding everything," Tessavor murmured, and no one asked her to explain what she meant by that. Karasin ordered a scout ship forward, small, fast, expendable, meant to slip past whatever passive defenses the humans had and bring back real data. The scout's pilot was young, ambitious, eager to be the one who broke through the fog. He flew confidently into the gap between two human shipping lanes that his charts told him was clear. It was not clear. It had never been clear. It had simply been made to look that way. The scout ship's engines died first, cleanly without so much as a warning light. Then its weapons, then its long-range communications, one after another, in an order too precise to be malfunction. The crew, when the Drevikai recovery team finally reached them 6 hours later under a cautious truce flag, were alive, unharmed, and thoroughly disoriented. They described no attack, no weapons fire, no enemy ships they had ever actually seen, only a strange, gentle nudge in their course, and then darkness, and then silence, as though something vast and patient had simply reached out and turned them off. "Luck," Karasin said, when the report reached him. "A defensive minefield we didn't chart. Nothing more." Tessavor read the recovery report twice before she spoke. "Overseer, the crew says the ship was guided, not disabled at random, guided into a specific position and then shut down without damage. That's not a minefield. That takes intent. That takes someone who already knew exactly where our scout would go before it went there." Karasin looked at her the way a man looks at someone repeating a rumor he's already decided not to believe. "You've spent too long trading grain quotas with farmers, Tessavor. You're starting to see strategy and weather." She didn't answer that. She was watching the tactical display instead, where dozens of small green markers, human trade vessels, colony shuttles, orbital tugs, moved through Meridian space in patterns that, now that she looked for it, were far too orderly to be ordinary traffic. It looked, she thought, like a system that had rehearsed this exact morning 100 times before. Karasin gave the order to advance the main fleet into the system, confident that whatever passive trickery the humans had managed with one scout ship, it would mean nothing against 300 warships. He was reaching for the comm to broadcast the invasion's opening terms, surrender demands, formalities he considered a courtesy, when every screen on the Ashwing Dominance Bridge lit up at once, along with every screen on every ship in his fleet, and, though he did not know it yet, every screen across the entire border sector of human and allied space. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration of war. It was a single recorded message, human-coded, time-stamped 11 years, 4 months, and 6 days earlier. Long before the Threshold Accord had ever heard of Meridian Station, long before Karasin had ever set a course for human space. A woman's face filled the screen, younger than the reports would have suggested, but unmistakably the same steady eyes, the same careful stillness. Amara Osei looked out at the fleet that would not exist to see this message for another decade, and she spoke as though she had rehearsed the words so many times they had worn smooth. "To whoever finally decides to try this," she said, "please, turn around. You don't know what you're flying into, and I promise you, none of us want to show you." The message ended. The bridge of the Ashwing Dominant fell into a silence that had nothing to do with sensors or jamming, a silence built entirely out of 300 officers realizing all at once that the woman on their screens had recorded that warning more than a decade before any of them had been born into this war. and that whatever she had built since then, she had built it with 11 years of warning that no one had listened to. Garrison recovered his voice before anyone else on the bridge did, which was, he told himself later, the only reason he still commanded that bridge by the end of the day. "A recording," he said, loud enough for the whole crew to hear. "An old message, dressed up to look prophetic. Humans are fond of theater. We've seen it in their trade negotiations, their little speeches about fairness and patience. This is the same trick, wearing a soldier's face." He straightened his shoulders. "Advance the fleet. Full invasion posture. I want Meridian Station's defenses mapped and neutralized within the hour." Tessavour said nothing this time. She had learned on human worlds that some warnings only made sense in hindsight, and she suspected, with a cold certainty she couldn't yet justify to anyone, that this was going to be one of them. She stayed at her post and did her job, because that was also something she'd learned from humans. You could disagree with an order and still execute it well enough to survive being right. The Dominion fleet crossed the outer marker of Meridian space in full formation, 300 warships moving with the confidence of a hammer that had never once missed a nail. The system did not fight back. That was the first wrong thing. Instead, space itself seemed to grow reluctant. Kerosine's helmsman reported gravitational drift where the charts showed none, subtle, shifting eddies that nudged ships fractions of a degree off their intended headings, always toward the same widening funnel between two moons that no survey had ever flagged as significant. Communications between ships began to fray at the edges, a hiss of interference that came and went in patterns too rhythmic to be natural weather, and too soft to trigger any alarm worth raising. Drone swarms rose from Meridian's asteroid belt, small, unarmed as far as any scan could tell, and drifted alongside the Dominion ships like curious fish, never firing, never approaching close enough to threaten, only ever present, always exactly where they'd be seen. "They're hurting us," Tessavour said quietly to the officer beside her. "Hurting us where?" She didn't answer. She didn't know yet. But she had stopped believing somewhere in the last hour that this was luck. While the fleet fell, unknowing, into a shape someone else had chosen for it, Tessavour used a quiet moment at her station to do the thing she'd wanted to do since the recording played. She pulled the public registry for Meridian Station, cross-referenced it against Dominion trade archives, and found something that made her stop breathing for a second. Meridian Station had been built, according to human colonial records, on the ruins of something called the Halvern Deep Space Research Facility, destroyed in an incident 12 years and 2 months ago. The date sat 1 month before humanity's first recorded contact with the wider galaxy. The records beyond that were sealed under a classification tier Tessavour had never seen a civilian government use. She filed the discovery and kept watching the tactical display, because there was nothing else to do, and because some instinct told her that whatever had happened at Halvern was not finished happening. In a bunker 300 meters beneath Meridian Station's surface, a facility that did not appear on any colonial blueprint the Dominion had purchased, Amara Osei watched the same tactical display from the opposite side, with Elias Vantor at her shoulder and her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. "They're not turning around," Vantor said. He'd said it twice already, as if repetition might change the answer. "No," Amara agreed. "I didn't think they would." Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone doing arithmetic she'd already done 1,000 times in her head and hoped never to need again. "So what happens now?" She looked at him, really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to with the younger staff, because caring about people made losing them worse. "Now we do the thing I built this station to do. We don't kill them, Elias. Do you understand that? Whatever happens in the next hour, nobody dies today if I can help it." He didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he nodded, because he trusted her more than he trusted his own confusion. Above them, a Drevakai boarding team breached what their scans identified as an undefended orbital habitat ring, expecting easy salvage or, at worst, panicked civilians to secure as leverage. They found neither. The ring was empty, stripped of furniture, supplies, anything of value, and wired instead with recording equipment, cameras angled with unsettling precision toward every corridor and airlock, as though someone had wanted this exact moment documented from every possible angle. "It's a stage," the boarding team's lieutenant reported back, unnerved despite himself. "They built us a stage." Karasin heard the report and felt, for the first time since entering the system, something that was not quite confidence. He pushed it down. "Theater," he said again, though the word tasted less certain in his mouth than it had an hour ago. "Continue the advance." In the bunker, Amara watched the fleet drift, unknowing, into the precise configuration Achebe's original models had predicted a decade ago, funneled, spread thin across the gravitational corridor, exactly where the system's dormant infrastructure could reach every hull at once. She thought, as she always did in moments like this, of a man who should have been standing beside her instead of existing only in the architecture he'd left behind. "Do it," she said. Vantor's hands moved across the console, and Meridian Station's defenses, silent, patient, disguised for 12 years as ordinary colonial infrastructure, activated all at once. There was no explosion, no fire. To an outside observer, nothing dramatic happened at all. Across 120 Dominion warships, engines simply lost cohesion and fused into inert metal. Weapon systems locked, targeting arrays froze mid-cycle, and reactor cores dropped into a stable, harmless idle that no engineer aboard could override. Life support held steady on every ship. Not a single Drevakai crew member was injured. In less than 4 minutes, 40% of Karasin's fleet went from an invading armada to a drifting museum of its former self. Engines cold, weapons dead, crews very much alive and very much aware of exactly how easily they could have not been. The silence on the Ashwing Dominance bridge this time was total. "Status," Karasin finally managed. "Weapons offline, fleet-wide, across affected ships," his tactical officer said, voice hollow. "Propulsion fused. Life support, nominal. Overseer, they didn't kill anyone. They could have. They didn't." Karasin stared at the display, at the neat, bloodless devastation of nearly half his fleet, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only from humiliation, that this had never been a battle. It had been a demonstration, delivered by a species that could have ended his career and his crew's lives in the same 4 minutes, and had chosen, deliberately, not to. His communications panel chimed. A private, unencrypted channel addressed specifically to him. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. Amara Osei's face appeared on his screen, calm, tired, entirely without triumph. "Overseer Karasin," she said, "I'm not going to pretend I enjoyed that. Tell your government we don't want this fight. We've already had it once." Behind her, just visible at the edge of the frame before the transmission cut, Karasin caught sight of a wall. Hundreds of photographs, human faces mostly, arranged with the careful permanence of a memorial. And among them, unmistakably, impossibly, several faces that were not human at all. Drevakai faces, staring out from beside the human dead, as though whatever had happened to put them there had claimed lives on both sides of some war Karasin had never even heard of. The transmission ended. Karasin sat very still in his command chair, staring at the blank screen, and for the first time in his career he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Word of the bloodless defeat reached the threshold accord within a day, and reached the rest of the galaxy within 3. It traveled the way only truly strange stories travel, faster than official channels could contain it, distorted a little more with every retelling, until a fleet disabled without casualties had become, in some tellings, humanity destroyed 300 warships with a whisper. The truth, as usual, was stranger than the exaggeration, and far harder to explain. Dos Breyanuk had spent 30 years as an Ithkar historian specializing in first contact incidents, which meant he had spent 30 years being professionally ignored. Nobody wanted a historian at a diplomatic crisis. They wanted soldiers and negotiators. But when the Meridian reports crossed his desk, technical, dry, utterly failing to explain how a colony with no recorded military history had immobilized a modern fleet without firing a shot, something in Doss's long career of being overlooked sharpened into focus. There's a story underneath this one, he told his research assistant, a patient Vren named Iset, who had learned to recognize the particular energy that meant DOS would not be sleeping that week. Nobody builds defenses like this for a first war. You build this because you've already had one and it went badly enough that you never want to feel that helpless again. He began requesting travel authorization to Meridian Station before the Accord had even finished its first emergency session. Karasin was recalled to Dominion High Command for review, which he had expected. What he had not expected was his own refusal, made in front of 3 admirals who outranked him, to frame the encounter as a defeat requiring retaliation. "We were disabled, not destroyed," he said, standing at attention in a chamber that had broken lesser officers with far gentler words. "If they had wanted us dead, Admiral, we would be dead. I want authorization to return and investigate, not with a fleet, with a delegation." "You want to negotiate with the people who humiliated you?" "I want to understand them," Karasin said, "before we decide they're an enemy worth losing more ships to." It was, he would later admit to no one but himself, the first genuinely honest thing he'd said in years. On Meridian Station, Amara Osei faced a harder audience, her own government. A secure transmission from Earth Defense Coordination arrived within hours of the engagement, and the officer on the other end, a woman named Director Reyes, who had signed off on Amara's original containment protocols over a decade ago, did not waste time on pleasantries. "You showed the memorial wall," Reyes said, on an open channel, to a Dominion overseer. "I know what I did." "That information has been locked for 11 years, Amara. We agreed." "I know what we agreed." Amara's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone thin and taut. "I was tired, Director. I've been running Cold Harbor drills for 6 years, waiting for a day I hoped would never come. And it came. And I looked at his face and I saw a man who genuinely believed he was fighting people who'd never had a war. I couldn't let him keep believing that." She paused. "Maybe that was a mistake. I'll live with it." Reyes was quiet for a long moment. "You've held this alone long enough," she finally said, and it was almost gentle. "Maybe it's time some of it stopped being a secret." Elias Vantor had not been part of that conversation, but he found the gap in Amara's personnel file 2 days later, while helping cross-reference historical station schematics against the Cold Harbor activation logs, a routine task that turned personal the moment he noticed her service record simply stopped for 11 months, 12 years ago, and then resumed at a different facility with a different clearance level, as though someone had cut a section out of her life and stitched the ends back together. He asked her about it directly, because he had learned that indirect questions bounced off Amara Osei like light off armor. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. "There was a research facility," she said finally. "Halvern Deep Space. I was an engineer there, not a soldier, not anything close to a soldier. We were studying gravitic drive theory, harmless academic work, 12 scientists, and about 40 support staff on the edge of nowhere." Her hands, Vantor noticed, had gone very still on the desk. "A faction attacked us. Not a government. We learned that much later. A rogue group, well-armed, testing something. We had no weapons, no training. We had improvised barricades in desperation, and a man named Ren Achebe, who was the best engineer I've ever known, and who spent the last hours of his life building something out of the facility's own systems that gave the rest of us time to get to the evacuation pods. He didn't make it. No." She said it simply, without asking for sympathy, which somehow made it land harder. "Meridian Station's defenses are built from what he left behind. Everything you've seen this week. I didn't design it, Elias. I finished it. There's a difference, and some days, it's the only thing that lets me sleep." Vantor didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Why didn't Earth ever tell anyone? You could have used this. Deterrence, leverage. Instead, you buried it." "Because the last time people found out what we were capable of," Amara said quietly, 40 of my friends died anyway. Weapons don't stop people who want to test them. Silence sometimes is the only thing that does." Half a system away, DOS Brea nuke had tracked down something that would make Amara's answer a great deal more complicated. Through old, half-buried Dominion service records, the kind normally scrubbed clean but occasionally missed by clerks who didn't understand what they were deleting, he found 3 Drevakai veterans, dishonorably discharged 9 years ago, who had once served under a commander conducting unsanctioned readiness exercises against an unnamed civilian target. Their testimony, filed and then buried, described resistance from the target that their superiors called impossible, and their own command structure refused to investigate. Doss brought the files to Kerosene the day the overseer arrived back at Meridian Station under a formal diplomatic flag, requesting, to the surprise of Amara's security staff, a face-to-face meeting with the director herself, not to negotiate terms, but simply, as he put it, to understand what kind of people we tried to conquer. They met in a small conference room near the command ring. No weapons, minimal staff, the kind of careful neutral space both sides needed to believe was safe. Kerosene studied Amara across the table, smaller than he'd expected, quieter, nothing about her posture suggesting the woman who had disabled a third of his fleet without raising her voice. "I want to ask you something honestly," he said. "And I want an honest answer, if you're willing to give one. Is your species a warrior culture? Is this—" he gestured vaguely at the station around them. "Restraint? Or is it simply patience before the real strike?" Amara considered him for a long moment. "We're a species that learned, the hard way, that surviving something terrible doesn't make you strong. It just makes you careful." She paused. "I could ask you something honest too, Overseer. Do you actually believe the attack on my colony was an isolated accident? Because I've spent 12 years assuming it was random. And something about the way you're looking at me right now tells me you know it wasn't." Kerosene didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid a data tablet across the table, the fragment Doss had recovered, a partial insignia pulled from decade-old Dominion service records, half corroded but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Amara looked at it, and Kerosene watched the color drain slowly from her face as recognition set in. Not of the insignia itself, which meant nothing to her, but of the shape beneath it, a design she had glimpsed once, 12 years ago, on the hull of the ship that had killed Renachebe. Karasen's voice, when he finally spoke, had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with diplomacy. This insignia belonged to a rogue cell operating outside Dominion sanction. Its commander vanished 10 years ago, presumed dead in a containment failure during unauthorized weapons testing. He met her eyes. "I trained under that commander for 6 years before he disappeared. Director Osei, I believe the officer who attacked your facility 12 years ago is not only alive, I believe he has spent the last decade building something a great deal worse than what he used on you the first time." His name, Kerosene explained, was Ashera Vol. Once a Dominion Commodore, once the closest thing to a mentor Kerosene had ever had, a man whose lectures on discipline and strategic patience Kerosene could still recite from memory. Vol had vanished 10 years ago under accusations of running unsanctioned weapons trials. His ship reported lost in a reactor containment failure that no one had ever actually investigated closely enough to confirm. "I mourned him," Kerosene admitted, and the admission cost him something visible, a small crack in the composure he'd worn like armor since Meridian. "I gave a eulogy at his memorial service, and for 12 years apparently he's been alive, testing weapons on a civilian research outpost that had no way to fight back. And no one, not me, not the Dominion, ever looked hard enough to notice he never actually died." Amara sat with the data tablet in her hands, staring at the corroded insignia as though it might rearrange itself into something less true if she looked long enough. 12 years, she repeated. "He's had 12 years since Halvern to keep going." "I believe so. And I believe he saw the reports from this week. The fleet you disabled. The same as everyone else in the Dominion did." Kerosene's jaw tightened. If he built a career out of proving that unprepared species can be exploited, then a species that just proved it couldn't be exploited is either his greatest threat or his greatest opportunity for proof that overwhelming force is the only thing that matters. It was not, either of them realized in that moment, a comfortable place to sit. Two officers from species that had every reason to distrust each other, forced now to consider that their actual enemy might be the same man, wearing two different uniforms 12 years apart. The alliance that formed over the following days was not built on speeches or treaties. It was built, mostly, by Elias Van Tor and Tessa Voer, who found themselves doing the unglamorous work of making two mutually suspicious command structures actually talk to each other, translating not just language, but assumptions, chains of command, the small cultural frictions that could derail cooperation faster than any weapon. Van Tor learned that Drevakai officers considered direct eye contact a challenge unless invited. Tessa Voer learned that humans apologized reflexively, constantly, and that it rarely meant what it sounded like it meant. Neither of them fully trusted the other's government. Both of them slowly began to trust each other. "You people are exhausting," Tessa Voer told him one evening, reviewing shared sensor logs in a cramped station office that smelled of recycled coffee. "You apologize for asking questions, you apologize for not knowing things, you apologize for existing in a room." "You people don't apologize for anything," Van Tor said. "It took me 2 days to figure out you weren't constantly insulting me." "I wasn't," she considered. "Mostly. It was, in its small way, the same work Karasin and Amara were doing at a larger scale. Learning, cautiously, that the assumptions built by 12 years of silence and mutual ignorance had been wrong in both directions." The investigation moved fast, driven by Dos Breanuk's dogged historical work and Tessa Voer's access to buried Dominion logistics records. A pattern emerged: black market purchases routed through shell companies, weapons-grade materials diverted from 3 different Dominion shipyards over a decade, all traceable, with enough patience, back to accounts that had technically belonged to a dead man. Then the pattern stopped being historical. An Ithkar research colony on the fringe of Accord space went dark without warning. When Doss, horrified, pulled the emergency response logs, the attack signature made his stomach drop. The same weapon profile, the same surgical testing precision that had once been used against Halvern. Not conquest, not resource extraction. A test, conducted on a new subject, exactly as methodical as the first. Doss survived only because he had left the colony 3 days earlier to pursue the Meridian story. He arrived back to find the research station he'd called a professional home for 6 years reduced to a debris field, and he brought the full weight of that evidence, logs, wreckage analysis, casualty reports, directly to an emergency session of the Threshold Accord. The chamber that had once laughed at humanity's silence now sat in horrified quiet, as Doss laid out 12 years of buried history in careful historian's detail. An unsanctioned Dominion commander, a supposed death that was never verified, a pattern of attack stretching from a human outpost to an Ithkar colony, and a species, humanity, that had absorbed the first blow alone and told no one. The reaction was immediate and dangerous. Several delegates called for military action against the Dominion itself, arguing that a government capable of losing track of one of its own commanders for a decade, while he conducted a private war, could not be trusted with the resources and technology it currently held. The Accord, fragile on its best days, teetered toward a vote that could fracture galactic peace entirely, not because of what humanity had done, but because of what the Dominion had failed to notice. Karasin made the hardest decision of his career in the middle of that session. He requested to speak, and when the floor was reluctantly given to him, he did not defend his government. He implicated it. Vol operated within Dominion structures for years without proper oversight, he told the chamber, his voice carrying to representatives of species that had, an hour earlier, been debating whether to declare war on his entire civilization. That failure is real, and it is ours. Will not stand here and pretend otherwise to save my own reputation. But punishing an entire government for one commander's crimes will not stop that commander. It will only make sure no one is left free to hunt him. He paused. Give all of us, Dominion and human forces together, the chance to end this before it becomes something none of us can walk back from. It was not eloquent. It was not the kind of speech that ended wars in stories. But it was honest in a chamber that had heard very little honesty that day, and honesty, delivered at personal cost, carried a kind of weight that polished rhetoric never could. The vote for military action against the Dominion was postponed, not cancelled but postponed, which in that room amounted to a rare and fragile grace. That evening, back on Meridian Station, Amara finally told Vantor the rest of it, not the sanitized version she'd given him days earlier, but the full architecture of what Achebe had built in his final hours. It's not just deterrence, she admitted, sitting across from him in the same bunker where she'd ordered the fleet disabled. Achebe didn't design a shield that just sits there. He designed a system that responds, passively at first, the way you saw with Kerosine's fleet. But it was built during a crisis, Elias, by a dying man trying to protect the handful of us who were still alive. It was never meant to run indefinitely, unsupervised. It was meant to end when the crisis ended. And did it end? I ended it, manually, every day, for 12 years. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion visible for the first time since Vantor had known her. I didn't finish Achebe's system, Elias. I've just been standing between it and the rest of the galaxy, holding it still. Vantor absorbed that in silence, turning it over, trying to understand the scale of what she'd carried alone for over a decade. Then something in the station's monitoring logs caught his eye, a routine background process he'd glanced past a dozen times in the last week without really seeing it. He pulled the timestamp data forward, cross-referenced it against the moment Kerosine's fleet had first crossed into the system, and felt something cold settle into his stomach. Amara. His voice had changed. This process, the one Achebe built, the one you've been holding still every day for 12 years, it didn't just activate when you disabled the fleet. He turned the display toward her, hands unsteady. It started counting the moment Kerosine's ships entered the system, 6 days ago, and it's still counting. Amara didn't move for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had the flat, careful quality of someone forcing calm onto something that wanted to be panic. Show me the full log. Everything from the moment it triggered. Vantor pulled it up, and together they read what Achebe's system had been quietly doing for 6 days, while everyone's attention stayed fixed on fleets and speeches and diplomatic recoveries. The passive defenses, the disabling of Kerosine's ships, the gravitic herding, all of it, had been the system's first, gentlest stage, exactly as Amara had always understood it. But the trigger that activated that first stage had also started a second process running underneath it, one she had never seen activate before because no hostile fleet had ever actually entered the system in the 12 years she'd maintained the override. It's a failsafe, she said slowly, piecing it together in real time. Achebe built layers. The first response is meant to be proportional. Disable, don't destroy. But if the threat isn't fully withdrawn, if it isn't resolved, the system assumes the proportional response failed and escalates. Automatically. He built it that way because at Halvern nobody had time to make careful decisions in the middle of dying. He wanted something that would keep protecting people even if there was no one left alive to make the call. Escalate to what? I don't know the full specifications. I never needed to. I've spent 12 years keeping it from ever reaching that stage. She was already moving, pulling up her own credentials, the manual override she had renewed personally, by hand, every single day since Meridian Station's defenses first went live. I stop it here. I've done this 1,000 times. She entered the sequence. The system did not respond the way it always had. Amara. Vantor's voice had gone tight. It's not accepting the override. That's not possible. I built the renewal protocol myself. You built it to renew on a schedule. Look at the trigger logic. The failsafe assumes a hostile fleet is currently present until it registers full, verified withdrawal from the entire system, not just a pause in aggression. Kerosine's ships are still here, Amara. Disabled or not, they're still here. As far as Achebe's system is concerned, the threat never actually left. The weight of that settled over the room like a physical thing. Every hour the Dominion fleet remained in Meridian space, for negotiation, for investigation, for the very alliance that was supposed to save everyone, pushed the failsafe closer to a threshold neither of them fully understood, built by a dying man who had never imagined a scenario where the enemy might stay, disabled and cooperative, for days on end. Amara worked through the night trying to build a new override. Hands steady even as the exhaustion of the past week caught up with her all at once. She had run on adrenaline and old grief for 6 days, and the body, eventually, always collects what it's owed. Vantor found her collapsed at her console just before dawn. Unconscious, her vitals dangerously low. The station's medical team arriving within minutes to find a woman who had held a galaxy's worth of restraint together alone for over a decade finally, catastrophically, running out. She woke in the station's medical bay 2 days later to Vantor's face and the particular quiet of a room where people had been waiting for bad news and were relieved not to get it. "You collapsed," he told her. "Stress, exhaustion, dehydration. The doctor said your body basically forced a shutdown because you refused to." He hesitated. "Amara, the countdown. I've been managing it with what you taught me, but I don't have your full understanding of Achebe's architecture. I've bought us time. I haven't stopped it." She tried to reconstruct the shutdown sequence in her mind and found, with a lurch of genuine fear that had nothing to do with the countdown itself, that pieces of it simply weren't there. The stress collapse had cost her something. Not everything, but enough. Details of Achebe's final design, memorized 12 years ago in the rawest days of her grief, sat just out of reach, like words on the tip of her tongue that refused to arrive. "How long do we have?" Vantor's silence answered before his words did. 6 hours. Maybe less. While Amara fought to reassemble memories that kept sliding away from her, the war of information continued above her, unaware of the deadline ticking beneath it. Karasin and Tessa Vur led a joint task force. Human volunteers and Dominion loyalists Karasin had personally vetted toward the coordinates Vol's rogue cell had used to stage the attack on the Ithkar colony. They fought with a discipline neither species had shown alone. Human precision targeting paired with Dominion heavy maneuvering. Restraint prioritized over annihilation whenever the tactical situation allowed it. A fighting style built consciously in the image of what Meridian had demonstrated a week earlier. Ships were disabled rather than destroyed wherever possible. Crews were captured, not killed. Observers from 3 other species, invited by the Accord to monitor the engagement, watched with the particular attention people pay when they're revising an opinion in real time. Vol himself was cornered in his command vessel 2 days into the engagement, his forces scattered, his black market resources finally exhausted after a decade of careful hoarding. He did not surrender quietly. "You think this is victory?" he said to Karasin over an open channel, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had never once doubted himself. "You think disabling ships instead of destroying them proves something noble? It proves you're soft, Velth. I tested that outpost 12 years ago because I needed to know what happens when something powerful meets something unprepared. I've spent a decade proving the answer. Unprepared things get exploited every time by someone. I would rather it be us, controlled and deliberate, than some worse thing we never see coming. You murdered scientists," Karasin said. "You murdered an entire Ithkar colony for the same theory." "I tested a theory," Vol corrected. "The galaxy is not the polite table you're sitting at right now, Velth. It's predators and prey pretending otherwise. I wanted proof before the wrong predator found that out the hard way." Das Breyanuk, watching the exchange from an Accord monitoring station, broadcast the full recording. Vol's own words, his justification laid bare in his own voice, across every Accord channel simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Whatever sympathy Vol might have found among species anxious about their own vulnerability evaporated the moment his ideology was heard plainly, without the comfortable distance of second-hand rumor. Public opinion, which had wavered dangerously toward blaming the Dominion wholesale, swung hard against Vol specifically, and cautiously, toward respect for the humans and reform-minded Drevakai, who had spent the past week proving his theory wrong in real time. It was, in the end, not enough to save the colony he'd already destroyed, or the friends Amara had lost 12 years earlier, but it was enough to end the story he'd been trying to tell about the galaxy. And it came just as 300 meters beneath Meridian Station's surface, Elias Vantor finally stabilized the failsafe's countdown through raw improvisation and Achebe's own decade-old technical messages, buying a temporary, fragile pause. It was not a solution. Vantor knew that even as he implemented it, watching the numbers hold instead of climb. The automated protocols, once triggered, could not simply be walked back with a patch. A full permanent shutdown required the original sequence, the one only Amara had ever fully understood, and the one her exhausted, damaged memory could no longer reliably produce. 24 hours, Vantor told her, when she insisted on being briefed the moment she woke. That's what the pause bought us. After that, without the real sequence, it activates fully whether Kerosine's fleet is still here or not. Amara closed her eyes, forcing herself back through the wreckage of a memory the body itself had tried to protect her from. Slowly, painfully, one fragment surfaced clean. Achebe, in the last hour before his death, sealing something, not data, something physical, into a capsule, and telling her, with the strange calm of a man who already knew he wasn't leaving, that if anyone ever needed the full sequence and couldn't find it anywhere else, they'd find it there. I sent it into deep space, she whispered, half to herself, half to Vantor, horror dawning as the memory completed itself. 11 years ago, a memorial launch. I thought I was honoring him. I didn't think I'd ever need what was actually inside it. Where is it now? Amara pulled up the old launch logs with hands that had gone cold. The trajectory data resolved slowly, mercilessly, into a location far beyond any ship's reasonable reach. Light hours away, she said, and the window we have left is 6. 6 hours, light hours of distance. No ship in either fleet's inventory could close that gap in time through normal means, and everyone in the cramped bunker beneath Meridian Station knew it, even as they scrambled through every alternative they could think of. It was Kerosene who offered the one option no one else had considered, arriving at the bunker in person the moment Tessavur relayed what Vantor had found. The Ashwing Dominance courier vessel, he said, without hesitation, without the careful political calculation that had defined every decision he'd made 2 weeks earlier. It's built for exactly this. Short bursts of speed no capital ship can match, at tolerances most crews would refuse to fly. I can make that run. That configuration wasn't built for a pilot to survive repeated stress at those tolerances, Tessavur said sharply. You'd be pushing a single-use rescue profile, Overseer, not a joyride. Then it's fortunate, Kerosene said, already moving toward the launch bay, that I only need to use it once. Amara caught his arm before he reached the door, a small gesture but one that stopped him more completely than any order could have. You don't owe us this. I owe your engineer a debt I can't repay by disabling half my own fleet in front of witnesses, Kerosene said. This is the only currency I have left that means anything, Director. Let me spend it. He left before she could argue further, Tessavur close behind him, already calculating burn profiles and life support tolerances with the ferocious focus of someone determined to bring her commander back alive despite himself. While Kerosene's courier vessel screamed out of Meridian space at tolerances that made his own automated warning systems shriek in protest, Amara turned back to the only tool she had left. Memory itself, fractured and unreliable, but not entirely gone. She sat with Tessavur's borrowed data terminal and Dos Breyanuk, who had arrived on the last transport before the crisis went fully classified, and together the three of them worked backward through every fragment Amara could still recall. Achebe's notes, his verbal habits, the specific idiosyncratic logic of a man who'd built his life's final work out of grief and love in equal measure. He never did anything the simple way, Amara said, half to herself, rebuilding a sequence one broken piece at a time. Even under fire, he'd stop and make sure a solution was elegant, like it mattered, like anyone was going to grade his work afterward. Her voice caught, just slightly. I used to tell him that would get him killed one day. I was right. I hate that I was right. Doss, quiet and careful, didn't interrupt her grief, only helped her hold the thread of it steady enough to keep working. The memory that finally broke loose hours into that desperate reconstruction arrived without warning, whole and unbearably clear. Not a technical detail, but the moment itself, 12 years old and untouched by time. Amara, 26 and bleeding from a wound she barely registered, being half-carried, half-shoved by Renachebe toward the last working evacuation pod while alarms screamed around them and the facility began its final collapse. He wasn't coming. She'd known it even then, some animal part of her recognizing what the calm in his voice meant. Live, he'd told her, sealing the pod himself from the outside, his hands steady even as everything around them wasn't. Someone has to remember this the right way, not as a weapon. As a warning we never had to use again. The pod launched. He didn't. Sitting in the bunker 12 years later, Amara understood finally and completely what he'd built and why. Not a weapon meant to win a war. A promise meant to prevent one, activated only in the truest extremity, and built in its very architecture to remember mercy even when mercy cost something. The full sequence, once that last memory settled into place, came back to her almost gently, the way things do when the body finally stops protecting you from them. Carrison reached the memorial capsule with 40 minutes left on Vantor's failing countdown, his courier vessel's hull groaning from stresses it had never been rated for. He retrieved it with hands that shook from exhaustion and radiation exposure both, and had just begun his return burn when 3 ships broke from cover nearby, Vol's last loyalists, a handful of true believers who had learned, through channels DOS would later trace back to a leak in Accord monitoring, exactly what that capsule contained, and exactly why destroying it mattered more to their cause than anything else left to fight for. If the failsafe activates in full, one of them broadcast, voice raw with the particular certainty of a lost cause, the galaxy finally sees what humans really are. Vol was right. It just takes proof. Tessa Vore, monitoring the engagement from a disabled support craft she'd insisted on flying despite Karasin's objections, made the only choice available to her in the seconds she had left. Her own ship's weapons were offline, damaged from the earlier engagement, but her engines still answered. She put herself between the Loyalists' firing solution and Carrison's courier vessel, and did not move, absorbing a hit meant for the capsule, her hull crumpling around her as she held position through sheer refusal to yield the space. She survived, barely gravely wounded, pulled from the wreckage of her own ship by a recovery team that would later call it the single most reckless and most effective piece of flying they'd ever witnessed. The capsule survived with her. Carrison's return burn, delayed by seconds that felt like years, finally carried the data home with 12 minutes to spare. Amara received the confirmed sequence with hands that had finally stopped shaking, cross-referenced it instantly against the version her memory had rebuilt, and found them matching, word for word, code for code, as though some part of her had known the truth all along and simply needed permission to trust it. She entered the final shutdown herself, in the same bunker at the same console 12 years and 1 impossible week after Renachebe had first built the thing she was now finally, completely, laying to rest. The countdown didn't just pause this time. It closed, the whole architecture folding down into dormancy, verified, permanent, a decade-long vigil finally allowed to end. In the weeks that followed, the Threshold Accord did something it had never done for any species before. It convened a formal session not to debate humanity's threat level, but to formally record, at DOS Brea Nuke's insistence, the full and complete history of the Halvern incident, the attack, the silence, the 12 years Amara Osi had spent alone, holding a galaxy's worth of restraint together, without ever once asking for recognition. The Accord's final statement did not call humanity the galaxy's strongest species. It called them, in language DOS himself had helped draft, a people who chose, at every opportunity to do otherwise, the harder path of restraint, and whose strength, when finally revealed, was inseparable from their capacity for compassion. The phrase "fastest defeat ever," which had spread through gossip and rumor before anyone understood what it actually meant, took on a new shape in the retelling. Not a boast about power, but a quiet testament to control. Karasin resigned his commission 3 months later, trading a career built on conquest for a newly formed joint commission on ethical defense technology. Human and Drevakai engineers working side by side, deliberately, on systems built to protect rather than dominate. Tessa Vore, recovering slowly but stubbornly from injuries that would have ended a lesser pilot's career, joined him as his first deputy, and made a point of reminding him, at every opportunity, exactly how insufferably sentimental he'd become. "You used to be terrifying," she told him once, watching him argue passionately with an engineering subcommittee about fail-safe ethics. "Now you cry at memorial ceremonies." "I contain multitudes," Carrison said, entirely unbothered. Doss published the complete history within the year. Halvern, Achebe, Vol, all of it, names restored to people who had spent 12 years as classified footnotes. It became against every expectation of a lifelong historian used to being ignored, required reading across a dozen species education systems. On a quiet afternoon on Meridian Station, beneath a sky that had for the first time in over a decade nothing left in it to fear, Amara Osei stood before the new memorial the colonists had built at her reluctant permission. Ren Achebe's name at its center, surrounded now by every name from Halvern that had gone unspoken for 12 long years. Elias Vantor stood beside her, no longer quite the earnest deputy who'd first flagged a strange gravitational reading what felt like a lifetime ago, but something steadier, someone she trusted completely to carry forward what she'd spent a decade protecting alone. Delegations were arriving throughout the day. Human, Dravikai, Ithkar, Vren, a dozen flags she'd never expected to see gathered peacefully on her station's landing pads. They came, she understood now, not out of fear of what humanity might do, but out of something she'd stopped believing the galaxy was capable of offering people like her: respect, freely given, for a kind of strength that had never needed to prove itself through conquest. Amara Osei looked out at them, at the names on the wall beside her, at the young man who had helped her carry a burden she'd never expected anyone to be strong enough to share, and for the first time in 12 years, she let herself smile. Quiet, genuine, and entirely without the weight of a secret she no longer had to carry alone.